Being an American is not letting someone else decide who you are and how you should be called. The American ideal is about freedom. Victor Green's Green Book allows us to tell that story from the perspective of human beings whose skin was colored.
The Green Book was a great way to understand how you could get from A to B safely. And even though it wasn't all about struggle and fear, there was a seriousness to traveling while Black, and there were severe consequences.
This book allows us to really just simply embrace the genius of us, the grace of us, the care of us, the creativity of us, the flyness of us, the sincere love of us as a community. It is actually the American story.
By the turn of the 20th century, the motor age was dawning all across the United States. African Americans embraced the automobile and the promise of the open road. But unlike white Americans, Black motorists could face a world of danger and discrimination each time they set out. They needed a survival guide to navigate the treacherous highways of segregated America. And soon they had one. The Green Book.
The Negro Traveler's Green Book.
The guide to travel and vacations.
Travel-wise people travel by the Green Book.
Carry your Green Book with you.
You may need it.
Too often people think that the racism, the Jim Crow, apartheid-like reality in the United States was just Southern. It isn't just Southern. It's national. It has different iterations. In the South, you do find signs that say colored and white. You do find moments where if you're going down a dark country road, that there is a sense of apprehension because very bad things have happened to African Americans, male and female, adult and child, down those dark roads by lynch mobs populated by people wearing white hoods or just white skin and feeling angry. But if you go up north, there are places where they won't have signs that say colored and white, but you know if you're an African American that you won't be served and you're not welcome.
We would go places, and I remember the routine had been my dad would get out first, check it out, and we sat in a car. Then he would come out after a few minutes and say, okay, we can go in. But Jennifer reminded me of one time where we had reservations. Was it a hotel?
It was a hotel reservation, and when Daddy showed up, they said all of a sudden there was no reservation.
He got back in the car very quickly and was upset. It was because it was late at night and dark.
They sent us down the road someplace. I remember my mother being very upset, and we ended up in this hotel or motel that was a converted barn. And I remember Mommy saying it smelled like the animals were still there.
And it did.
For decades, millions of African Americans faced this challenge of what is today known as driving while Black. But in the 1930s, one man had an ingenious solution to this problem. Victor Green was a postal worker from Harlem, New York, one of the fastest growing African American communities in the country. But even in his own neighborhood, African Americans were unwelcome at many hotels and other establishments. And at Harlem's famed nightclubs such as the Cotton Club, where top Black entertainers like Lena Horne and Duke Ellington packed the house every night, Blacks were not allowed to sit in the audience. In 1936, Green created and published the first Negro Motorist Green Book, which listed businesses where Black customers were welcome.
The idea of the Green Book is to give the Negro traveler information that will keep him from running into difficulties, embarrassments, and to make his trips more enjoyable.
The Green Book started out only listing locations in New York, mainly in Harlem. Two of the most prominent were the Hotel Teresa and the YMCA, which served as one of Harlem's most important recreational and cultural centers. During the 1930s, dancers from the Cotton Club rehearsed at the YMCA. And many famous luminaries such as writer Langston Hughes and boxer Joe Louis stayed there. But the Green Book would soon outgrow Harlem. And by the time it ended publication, it had become more than just a travel guide. It had become a roadmap to some of the most significant people, successful businesses, and most important political milestones of the 20th century.
It's important to have everyone in this nation examine the significance of the Green Book. If you don't see the history, if you don't see where it was, how can you say it happened?
Eventually, the Green Book would list more than 9,500 places between its pages. Today, only about a third of those sites are still standing.
We need to find those places, and we need to see them, and we need to revere what they meant, because they made all of the difference to our survival.
Carry your Green Book with you. You may need it.
And in certain areas across the country, Black travelers' lives literally depended on the Green Book. Both big cities and small towns could pose real dangers. One particular threat were communities known as sundown towns.
A sundown town varies in definition but not in function. It is a place where African Americans are not welcome. And there were places that would put up a sign on the edge of town that would say, "Don't let the sun go down on you here."
These were not idle threats. If you were in that town at a particular time, you could have harm laid on your head. You could actually be lynched.
There are many instances where African Americans would pass through and there would just be hysteria. A woman would see an African American man and start screaming. He didn't talk to her. His presence was enough to spark this kind of hysteria.
There were thousands of sundown towns throughout the country. A lot of them would have a sign. There were others that, would ring a bell at 6 p.m., alerting the Black domestics and laborers in the town of when they had to go. Sundown towns were largely a northern, midwestern, and western construct. The state of Illinois had hundreds of sundown towns. Mississippi had 13.
The state of Missouri alone is alleged to have had over 200 sundown towns. One of the most notorious was Pierce City in the southwest corner of the state.
Pierce City is rather picturesque. It also was the oldest of the major towns right around here, having started in 1870s. The town had a significant population of African Americans until there was a terrible weekend.
In August of 1901, a white woman was murdered. Within hours, a Black man named Will Godley was accused and arrested for the crime.
Throughout the day, the tensions have been growing. The mob congeals. They drag out Will Godley. They drag him back from that corner, back to the Decatur Hotel. They take him up to the second floor, push him off the second floor balcony, and the mob on the ground shoots him to pieces.
But the violence didn't stop there. A group of men broke away from the mob and headed over to the Black side of town.
So somebody sneaks over and sets each of the 5 houses on fire. So the fire department's not going to respond to that. But at this point, it was apparent to the African Americans that they can't stay there. So that's when they make a run for it, away. So bit by bit, for the next 2 days, the African Americans gathered what they could and left. And that was the end of the African American community in Pierce City.
It was a subject that wasn't brought up often at all, and it just there might have been some people, you know, way back there who were proud of what they did, but my parents never discussed it at all. But it gave Pierce City a kind of a bad reputation. As a child growing up, as a boy in school, you know, I just heard very little about that episode, but in school, we played football with other communities that had black kids playing football, but there were none in Pierce City. They avoided Pierce City.
What happened in Pierce City was not unique. Between 1882 and 1968, there were more than 4,000 recorded lynchings in the U.S. Many more were not documented. Across the nation, families fled from violence seeking safety. Nowhere was this African-American exodus more pronounced than from the South.
Jim Crow is serious in the South. I mean, there's segregation everywhere, but in the South, segregation is backed up by a high level of violence. They're really refugees from terrorism. But they're not just running away from something. They're coming to get something, too. Economic opportunities for African Americans down south are limited. Many African Americans are locked into tenant farming, sharecropping, and other forms of low-skilled labor. And the kind of opportunities they can have in the city far outweigh anything they can do down south.
In the early 1900s, millions of African Americans fled north to cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, and Detroit.
There are many ways that people leave the South, but if you're leaving by a car, the Green Book allows free passage away from the horrors that can fall on your head if you're a person of color.
When African Americans come to the city of Detroit during the Great Migration, they run into the northern version of Jim Crow. Where they can live is restricted. Where they can open up a business is restricted. What hotels will allow them to stay there is restricted. And so they need a guidebook like the Negro Motorists Green Book to help them guide themselves in the North.
Green Book listings in Detroit included spots like Hotel Gotham and Hotel Fairburn, the first downtown hotel to cater to African Americans. The Fairburn became popular with men who had left behind their families to work in the car factories that were springing up all over the city.
The African American population and the growth of the car industry go hand in hand in the city of Detroit. My family came from down south. My mother's side comes from Alabama, and my father's side comes from Georgia. My grandfather came up in 1939, and he's going to get a job at Ford.
During the 1930s, Ford Motor Company became the largest employer of black workers in the city, as Henry Ford forged personal relationships with leading black ministers.
Second Baptist Church is the most significant because it's going to work with Henry Ford and Ford Motor Company to help recruit African Americans from the South to come to the city of Detroit.
The automobile has been a special blessing to the Negro, for the Negro is getting better wages and doing more business in the automobile industry than any other industry in the world. The future looks bright as the automobile business has just begun.
And so now African Americans have a disposable income that they never would have had as a sharecropper or a tenant farmer down south.
Cars were not just a convenient way of traveling from A to B. Owning a car showed that you had entered a new economic class.
Having a car, of course, meant something for African Americans. It meant that you had arrived.
For some African Americans, owning an automobile was a big deal. more so than owning a home. Owning a Cadillac was a big deal.
As African American car ownership grew, so did demand for the Green Book. By the 1940s, there were listings in almost every state.
Each year, we are compiling new lists as new business places are started, giving added employment to members of our race.
The guide even expanded into international locations. But back home, there were still states where finding any places that would welcome Black travelers was almost impossible.
North Dakota is kind of an interesting state because there's actually a group of letters that were published in the Green Book where you can see how Victor Green was trying to find businesses that were willing to list in the Green Book. Canada and Mexico were in the Green Book, and still North Dakota was not participating. And so Victor Green was trying to find out why. And some of these letters are really telling because they're like, well, there's just not enough Black people out here. We just don't know if it's such a good idea.
Despite these gaps, Green expanded the listings with each edition and eventually printed around 15,000 copies a year.
There were all kinds of businesses listed, everything from just what you would find in a AAA guide, but also liquor stores and drug stores, sanitariums, and doctors. But it was also very telling in terms of how many areas of Black people were shut out of in regular lives.
There will be a day sometime in the near future when this guide will not have to be published. That is when we as a race will have equal opportunities and privileges in the United States. It will be a great day for us to suspend this publication, for then we can go wherever we please and without embarrassment.
To gather the listings for the Green Book, Victor Green used a national network of Black postal workers and representatives. They were his boots on the ground, distributing the book and encouraging business owners to advertise in it. Green also had early support from one major corporation, Esso Standard Oil. One of the most powerful companies at the time recognized the power of the growing African American market.
It was Esso gas stations that was the key to making the Green Book what it became. Esso was way ahead of its time. They had hired 2 Black marketing executives to understand the market.
Esso marketing executive James Jackson signed an agreement with Victor to distribute and promote the Green Book.
Jackson has used these guides, has helped it to prosper, and has personally directed an all-out campaign to enlighten the traveler about the numerous fine Negro business places throughout the country.
They hired Black men to franchise their own gas stations. They hired Black chemists.
Esso was a corporate trailblazer in hiring Blacks to fill top positions. And other industries were opening up as well. African Americans were increasingly breaking into professions that had previously been closed to them.
There are doctors and lawyers and university professors, and there are morticians, people who can afford to have the privilege of vacation.
But African Americans were still shut out of many places of recreation and relaxation.
Beaches were segregated, pools were segregated. They would have one day of the week where Black people could swim, and it was the day before they cleaned the pool.
Pools also served as flashpoints for racial conflict, with violence often breaking out.
Manager James Brock tossed cleaning chemicals inside the pool in an effort to get the Negroes to leave.
So African Americans created their own spaces where they could vacation free from harassment.
Victor Green knew there were enough Black people in the country who would not only use this guide for safety, but wanted this guide for pleasure. And so he knew his market. You know, he was a businessman.
In 1948, Green added an important new feature to the Green Book. He created a travel service where readers could reserve accommodations at hotels and resorts listed in the guide. Soon, resorts catering to African Americans flourished all over the country. American Beach in Florida, Atlantic Beach in South Carolina, Murray's Dude Ranch in California.
What's wonderful about the Green Book is that it uncovers what is a really, truly hidden truth about the African American community. Regular people populating something called middle class, taking time to have excursions across the nation, to go to Yellowstone Park, or to go down to the beach. Victor Green's Green Book shows you yes.
One Black resort in Northwest Michigan would become legendary: Idlewild.
Two guys came and started selling land to the African Americans here in Idlewild. And then their friends, of course, started telling others, and that's pretty much how this area came about. It was a safe haven, a place for people to come to travel through where they wouldn't have any issues. That's why Idlewild itself was in the Green Book.
First time that Idlewild is listed in the Green Book, it has something like 4 hotels, I think something like 15 restaurants, its own gas stations. So Idlewild was a gold mine for people using the Green Book and to get there. And they knew that they had a place to stay. And once they got there, it was like heaven.
My dad was a lawyer in Detroit, and he purchased land when I was 7 and built this house. So I've been here since I was 7 years old, and now I'll be 78. This was a place that you were free to bike, we were free to swim, we were free to just visit with each other and have a wonderful time. And we would ride every morning. And they'd come home and have lunch, and then go to the beach in the afternoon. You met your friends, you played cards, you swam, and you had fun for the afternoon until the 6 o'clock whistle. And then you had to come home.
During its heyday in the 1950s, Idlewild was one of the largest resort communities in the Midwest.
You had individuals who were driving there with flashy Cadillacs and convertible tops, Lincoln Town cars. These are the days in Idlewild when gents wore suits and black ties, and the women wore mink coats and long, beautiful gowns.
The beating heart of Idlewild's booming nightlife was the Flamingo Club, owned by developer Phil Giles.
First it was a bar and a patio. Then he added the club part. That's when it became the Flamingo Club. And he really put Idlewild on the map.
It was just nothing but people.
Any weekend, you could find 25,000 people visiting Idlewild. Cars parked along the street for miles, and people walking to get to the clubs or to somebody's house that they're having a party, etc. That was Idlewild.
Senators, political people, everybody came to Idlewild. I was born and reared here. I'm 81 years old. So those were my mentors. The ladies were so glamorous, and they dressed so glamorous, and the men were to die for. This place was so full all the time. They'd run out of spaces to live, you know, accommodations, no hotel rooms, nothing left. They would take their baths in the lake and then change and dress out of their cars. Right. But they wasn't gonna leave Idlewild.
World-famous performers entertained the visitors to the resort. Among them, Louis Armstrong and Dinah Washington.
They were singing and jamming on the inside. I was a waitress. Sarah Vaughan was my lady. And when I carried her change, she had gave me a $100 bill. She said, "Keep the change, darling."
But when those entertainers left the safety of Idlewild to perform around the country, they still had to contend with racism.
I've been playing music for probably, I would say like 40 years, I guess, as long as I can remember. I was a young guy, a teenager. The older musicians that I played with, they were constantly worried about whether or not they were being harassed. It was always a lesson in this is what you do, this is what you don't do. I was getting rules that were handed down for generations. When you take a break, you don't go into the vicinity of where the people are that you're playing for. If you need to eat something, you go out and eat it. And then you come back in when it's time for you to play.
A superstar like Nat King Cole, who sold millions of records worldwide and had his own national TV show, still had to deal with the same restrictions. And even playing by the rules wasn't enough to overcome the threat of violence.
Nat King Cole was, first of all, an incredible musician. I look at him as being the first true crossover artist. Nat King Cole was performing for an all-white audience right here in this very place in the Boutwell Auditorium in 1956, and he was attacked.
Cole was in the middle of performing when a group of white men from the audience, members of an offshoot of the KKK, rushed on stage and knocked him to the floor. The men were apprehended by security. Cole stopped his performance.
As I understand, the majority of them wanted to hear Nat play, and they begged him to come back on stage after he went off stage for a while to check himself out to see if he was okay, but Nat said he was in pain, and he did not come back out to perform.
The attack was widely covered in the press. Billboard magazine wrote an uncharacteristically political editorial, stating that the incident had focused national attention to the fact that a gentleman of outstanding character and talent may not travel with freedom and safety in prejudiced areas of the country.
Very interesting to be a star on one hand and to just be 3/4 of a man on the other hand, so to speak. He had to stay in his place. Can you imagine he could have a white promoter, white manager, but he still had to deal with being black.
In 1956, the same year that he was attacked in Birmingham, Nat King Cole re-recorded one of his most popular songs, Route 66. It was an homage to the iconic highway that stretched nearly 2,500 miles from Chicago to Los Angeles. Known as the Main Street of America, or the Mother Road, Route 66 provided a way for millions of Americans to travel west. But though Cole could sing about it, like other African Americans, he was not allowed to stay in many of the hotels, use the restrooms, or eat in the restaurants that lined the highway.
The imagery and the brand associated with Route 66 is you just jump in your car and the chrome-finned Chevys and the let's go back to the good old days and get our kicks on Route 66 was very much designed for a white audience, and that was really designed for the white experience. People spent weeks preparing to, get on a road trip if you were a black family. It became a situation where you were very prepared for anything and everything. You packed shoebox lunches with fried chicken, they generally had a fruit, sweet potato pie, a vegetable. You packed sheets as partitions if you needed to use the bathroom outside.
And you packed the Green Book, but even the most prepared traveler could run into trouble.
Driving west, you can drive for hundreds of miles and not have any place to stay. In 1955, there was an article saying there's just so many black people having accidents, and the sheriff couldn't understand it, and an NAACP representative said, well, because they're exhausted and it's fatigue, there's nowhere for them to stay. Driving Route 66 from Chicago to LA, 44 out of the 89 counties on Route 66 had sundown towns.
One of the few places on Route 66 that welcomed black travelers was Alberta's Hotel in Springfield, Missouri. In 1954, the owner, entrepreneur Alberta Ellis, listed her hotel in the Green Book. For a number of years, it was the only Springfield hotel listed.
Alberta, and we called her by her first name, Other people called her Miss Alberta, and it didn't matter who it was. When she was doing business around the city, whether it was white folks or black folks, most people tended to call her Miss Alberta. She just was a very straightforward woman. She was beautiful. I admired her a lot. I used to just watch her. I loved the way she dressed. I loved the way she interacted with people. I loved the way she was able to just pay for things and buy what she wanted. And I think she was a woman who was ahead of her time.
She worked for the Bell Telephone Company, and she used that to buy property. She started with the snack shop.
And then she bought the old city hospital. She showed up at the auction and she had $10,000 in cash and they had to sell it to her.
And then she parlayed that into the hotel. The place was always full. I lived there as a young man. My job there was to be the gopher. In other words, go for this, go for that, move that bed, empty that room, reset that room over there because we now
You had to earn your keep.
I had to definitely earn my keep.
When you think about what was happening in society in this country between 1954 and, let's say, 1964 or 65, that was a period of great change.
Great change.
And to think that Alberta and some others were able to still succeed.
Alberta wasn't alone. Some of the most successful businesses listed in the Green Book were owned by women.
Many of them were beauty parlors. Many of them would be hotels or nightclubs. Many of them would be catering businesses. Successful businesses have been owned by women forever. But you can forget that if you don't have evidence. The Green Book gives you evidence.
It opens a door to revisit Black history, to look to see what roles women played as entrepreneurs. In the recording of 20th century history, we did not include women enough. But as we revisit and go back and look at history and learn what kind of roles they serve, they provide very important services to African-American consumers.
Women were also the bedrock of the growing civil rights movement, and many of their establishments became critical hubs for activism. One of the most notable of those businesses listed in the Green Book was founded by civil rights pioneer Majeska Monteith Simpkins, the Motel Simbeth in Columbia, South Carolina.
My Aunt Majeska was a firebrand. Strong, articulate, funny, able to hold her own in any conversation or debate, brave. She would attend KKK rallies and come back and tell us about it, and we were all terrified that she might never make it home one night.
White supremacists attacked the Motel Simbeth several times because of Majeska's political work.
She would keep politicians honest by telling them what she felt. Also had a way of calling them in the middle of the night and waking them up to tell them what she thought and then hanging up. In those days, she said, my phone number is unlisted. They can't call me back, so I can tell them what I think.
Majeska also co-founded and worked at the first and for many years only Black-owned bank in South Carolina. Her work there helped to fund both the motel and her activism. In 1963, Majeska orchestrated a major integration victory in her home state with the help of her niece.
The University of South Carolina was segregated, and I did ultimately integrate the university. I was drawn into that one Sunday afternoon when Aunt Majeska said, why don't you just send an application down there and see what they'll do? Well, that was the first step of the rest of my life, because once they did not accept me, then the next step was, you have to file a lawsuit. They can't tell you no. And then the judge decided that I should go. I had no choice except to say yes, I was going.
You have urged other qualified Negro students to take advantage of this court's class action that pertains to the University of South Carolina. Do you know if any others plan to do this?
Well, I've heard quite a few say that they hope to apply to the university and they want to attend. So I'm sure that there will be some others who will enter.
It was work that needed to be done, and we did it. Aunt Majeska had a vision for social change that many could not embrace. Majeska was stirring up things that would perhaps cause some retribution on the community. She was working on ideas whose time had come, but people still had fear. And so, despite her vision, there was fear.
By the early 1960s, demand for social and political change was sweeping the nation. This push for empowerment was reflected in the pages of the Green Book.
So it becomes a much more political guide at that time. Right when you open up, it says, know your rights, and it goes state by state, listing, what the law is here, what your rights are if you feel you've been discriminated against, and who to go to.
While across the country, the civil rights movement was in full swing, the epicenter of violent white resistance was Birmingham, Alabama. But Birmingham was also home to one of the most important unsung heroes of the movement, businessman and civic leader A.G. Gaston.
Welcome to the A.G. Gaston Motel. It was one of 11 sites in Birmingham that was included in the Green Book. The civil rights movement would descend on the motel and take this over as their headquarters. It's where Dr. King, Reverend Abernathy, Reverend Shuttlesworth, and 25 leaders here in Birmingham had their war room.
You can never whip these boys if you don't keep you and them separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
In 1963, civil rights leaders called Birmingham, policed by Bull Connor, the most segregated city in America. The efforts of local black leaders to desegregate public facilities was supported by a national campaign. Project C, Project Confrontation.
Dr. King standing here before they launched Project C in the protest marches. All of the planning activity was housed in this war room, which was historically room 30.
The owner of the motel, A.G. Gaston, was already a legendary figure in Birmingham. Gaston had worked his way out of poverty to become one of the most successful black businessmen in the country. And he would become an instrumental player in Project Confrontation.
As it was all of us in the same pot, we was self-survival. It wasn't so much it happened myself, it happened the other fellas, so we all could survive. That was my interest in the civil rights movement. It wasn't a selfish movement, it was for all of us.
A.G. Gaston, to me, was, in addition to being a hero of mine, was my uncle. My aunt and uncle were in the full flush of success in their business lives when I would come down as a child. There were the funeral homes, there was the insurance company, there was the bank, they had the business college, he had real estate holdings. This motel was about respect for people. My uncle had gone through the Holiday Inn chain and researched what a nice hotel looked like and built the A.G. Gaston Motel on that model and looked for, the curtains, the bedspreads, all of that was custom made. It was a really first-class place. As some would describe, the finest black hotel in America at the time.
Gaston made his fortune by starting businesses that served and advanced the black community. But instead of openly challenging the segregated political and social structure of the time, he had always been careful to operate within it.
My uncle was a conservative person. He did not believe in street protests. He wanted to negotiate a peace he had negotiated throughout his lifetime, incremental advances for blacks. But as we know, by the time the 60s came, incremental was not good enough. There had to be some confrontation. And the actual focus of the protest was the department store, an area that my uncle knew well. Martin Luther King decided that what had to happen was that blacks who could buy things in these department stores should be able to take the elevator, be able to use the restrooms. They were happily taking your money, but they were not affording you any of the privileges that came with that. So it was the effort to desegregate department stores. And my uncle, he really was the man behind the scenes, enabling the negotiation between the store owners and Martin Luther King.
Gaston also let leaders of the movement stay at his hotel for free.
I provided the funds for the civil rights folks who was agitating it. They had no place to stay, and that's when I put them up at the motel down there. They had no money. I didn't participate actively in front of the organizations, but I financed them.
When Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and went to jail and wrote the infamous letter from a Birmingham jail, it was my uncle who bailed him out.
A.G. Gaston paid the bond to release Dr. King, who had been charged, alongside Reverend Abernathy, with demonstrating without a permit. But after they were released, the violence only escalated.
What differentiated Birmingham from other cities was that Birmingham was so visibly brutal. That Bull Connor would bring out dogs on children, would bring out fire hoses calibrated high enough to strip the bark off of trees. People who were planting bombs, for major destruction. So it wasn't just, let's frighten them. It was, let's kill them. And that's what Birmingham was like, and that's why it was called Bombingham. My uncle and Martin Luther King had this huge debate. All along, they would disagree about the way to go forward. But my uncle was in his office looking out of his window when he saw Bull Connor's fire hoses lift a child off her feet and tumble her down the sidewalk, that he decided that the only way to go forward was to join this movement and to participate in the protest, to participate in the revolution.
On May 10th, 1963, the civil rights leaders held a press conference in the courtyard of the Gaston, announcing an agreement to begin desegregation of public facilities. The very next day, near the room where Martin Luther King had been staying, a bomb exploded. This set off another series of violent public confrontations that lasted for days and caused national outrage. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson had promised to pass a civil rights bill ending legal segregation, but it had been stalled in Congress. Johnson's position had evolved. He had started his political career as a senator in heavily segregated Texas. Now, events in Birmingham, along with growing unrest across the country, were a turning point in his push to pass the bill. But his change of heart was also personal. Zephyr Wright, Johnson's longtime cook, had spoken to him of the difficulties that she and her husband had encountered when traveling. And when Johnson lobbied Congress for passage of the bill, he used Zephyr's experiences as evidence.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history. He uses nearly 100 pens to affix his signature and date. The integration leader, Martin Luther King, receives his pen, a gift he said he would cherish.
The president also gave one of the pens to Zephyr Wright, telling her, "You deserve this more than anyone else." She is even credited for Johnson's inclusion of a specific section of the bill, which outlawed discrimination in public facilities, including in motels, restaurants, restrooms, and swimming pools. But the end of legal segregation had unintended consequences.
The world is changing. What starts to occur is a loss of clientele for these really extraordinary businesses. They're no longer as vibrant, no longer making the money they were making, because the population starts to move outward from the Black community, in a sense, joining the wider community. So the change in integration, the change in accessibility does indeed start to detract from those businesses.
As African Americans are able to go to other places, African American businesses who at one point competed with one another have to compete with well-heeled establishments that have much more money and have much more clout and much more power. And so African American businesses in many cases are unable to compete.
Alberta's hotel shut down in 1965. The Motel Simbeth also closed its doors around the same time. Victor Green died before the Civil Rights Act passed. After 30 years, it seemed his dream of a future where the Green Book wasn't necessary might become a reality. For decades, it had been the Black traveler's guide to freedom. But today, only a fraction of its listed sites remain. Most of them are in disrepair and in desperate need of attention.
The impact on Black businesses is visible in the historic places that we see. There has been an ongoing economic decline. We're building a national coalition of preservation partners that will help to bring life back to these nationally significant historic buildings. Preservation isn't only about telling the full American history. It's about economic development. It's a tool for justice, equity. So we want to harness the full power of these places to be able to uplift and empower Black Americans and our entire nation.
I do think the idea of supporting Black-owned businesses is vital. It's very, very vital. Maybe we did learn something about integration, dissolving very important businesses. And maybe we're just simply saying, not again.
Our hope is that we can renew these commercial corridors and these historic neighborhoods to empower American citizens.
The Green Book's legacy continues, and the guide itself is being rediscovered by a new generation of Americans. In Idlewild, residents have mobilized to buy disused buildings and put them back into use.
The historic Wilson grocery store, the one grocery store that was here in Idlewild. Right now, this is owned by my father. He actually purchased the property to keep the preservation going. People are hearing about the history, finding out that this is some real rich soil, some rich shoulders that they can actually stand on and say, hey, I can be proud of where I come from. And so they're starting to reclaim that, and so we're starting to get a resurgence of people actually coming back into Idlewild.
In New York, the City Council recently voted to designate the Harlem YMCA as a city landmark, officially recognizing its historical and cultural significance.
The power of knowing about Victor Green's businesses that were noted from 1936 to 1967 in his books is to know a community that now is almost echoes of itself, but it was real. It was vibrant, it was alive, it was brilliant, it was successful. I think it's important to know that these places were there. I think it's important to actually go there and almost hear the echoes of brilliance, colored-skinned brilliance.
A.G. Gaston sold his motel in 1986. He lived until he was 103 years old, and at the time of his death in 1996, his net worth was estimated to be more than $40 million. In 2017, President Barack Obama signed a proclamation designating the Gaston Motel as a National Historic Monument.
When you think of the Black story in America, it's often rooted in a painful past, of course, slavery. It's rooted in our activist spirit, civil rights. But when you talk about entrepreneurship, it is an untold part of American history. The historic A.G. Gaston Motel, and I consider this to be a historic monument to the optimism and perseverance of American entrepreneurship. The idea for reuse is to continue this historic use as a motel. We think visitors would love to stay in a Green Book site, let alone in the A.G. Gaston Motel.
Telling the story of this book and how it was used and who used it and what businesses were on this book allows us to see a country, almost a parallel country, where people lived and thrived and created and grew opportunities of appreciation for themselves and for their community. When I think about Victor Green, I think about revolution and resistance. part of a traditional revolution that includes Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and Martin King and Rosa Parks. He's part of that revolution. If we can walk in circles or down streets that allow for past communities, past inhabitants, long gone, to somehow whisper in the air their presence, their stories, their expectations, their truth, I think how wonderful for us to have visions that are real, that are refurbished, that are true, that are indeed evidence. Club Hall, Club Caverns, Ebony,
Oakmere Hotel, McKnight's Home,
W.H. Reynolds, Florida Avenue,
Paradise Gardens, Comfort, Bay Avenue,
Palm Leaf, Blue Haven,
New Hollywood, Grand Casablanca,
The H. Gaston Motel.
Browns, Engelberg, and Taylor's.